So in case you haven't seen Loki yet, stop watching this video now because I'm about to bring up a bunch of spoilers. So the first season of Loki just came out on Disney Plus and it's packed. I mean, I came in watching this series not that excited because as much as I am a fan of the MCU, committing myself to a series was not something I get that excited for, if I'm being honest. And since it's just a series, I didn't think it would be as good or important as the normal MCU movies. But I can now say that I was wrong. Loki was way better than I thought it would be, and way more important to the MCU as a whole. So I'm going to rate this series based on the following factors: its characters, its storyline, and its visual aesthetic. So let's go. The story picks up where Avengers Endgame left off. Well, technically, it picks up from a scene in Avengers Endgame picking up from a scene where the first Avengers movie left off. It's when future Iron Man and Ant-Man messed up when visiting the end of Loki's battle, which led to Loki getting hold of the Tesseract and disappearing, with no mention of where he went. Now I'm glad the series finally gives clarity on what happens, because after watching Endgame all those years ago, I did wonder what kinds of implications that mistake had on the time mechanics of the MCU. Well, now we know. The series really sheds light on the complexity of the MCU's concept of time and time travel introduced in Endgame, because as it turns out, it's all being controlled by the TVA and He Who Remains. Each consecutive episode of the series felt like it added whole new aspects to the story, which kept me engaged. However, the episode on Lamentis did feel like a filler episode and was probably the worst episode of the bunch. The story didn't progress as much in that episode because it focused on Sylvie and Loki getting to know more about each other. Aside from that, the storyline undoubtedly led me confused. I mean, it's time travel, so obviously, right? But I felt like there were a couple of plot holes that I still can't explain after thinking about it a lot. Like if Sylvie is a variant because she isn't a dude like the Loki in the Sacred Timeline that we know, then why did it take the TVA years before she was kidnapped as a kid? Shouldn't they have kidnapped her as soon as she was born? Because our Loki was kidnapped as soon as he got the Tesseract, which was at the very beginning of his new Nexus event branch. Same goes for the other Lokis. They all have different costumes and do not in any way look like they derive from the Sacred Timeline Loki based on the way they look and their costumes. Shouldn't all non-Tom Hiddleston Lokis be kidnapped at birth? That part really confused me. That's just one of a couple more plot holes that I still couldn't wrap around my head. But the plot twist ending was such a good ending. Finding out that Loki ended up in a different timeline with Kang as a timekeeper and realizing that the TVA was also part of the timeline instead of being a separate entity was such a cool thing to see. It's got me hooked onto the next season, for sure. Now the characters. The characters in this series were pretty good. I love the character development of Loki from being egotistical to more emotional, which is not something we'd seen much of before. I think Owen Wilson's character too was good because he was imperfect but faithful that things could work out even if they couldn't, or they wouldn't. Sylvie's character, on the other hand, is interesting because she was propped up to be this mastermind that was vastly superior to Loki. And even though she was, we find her to be more vulnerable and vengeful, especially in the final episode. He Who Remains, aka a variant of Kang the Conqueror, which we'll see again in the next Ant-Man movie, was not what I expected at all, if I'm being honest. He was a lot more jumpier and theatrical for someone controlling all of time. Not sure if that's how I would like that character to be, but you know, it wasn't that bad. But when combining He Who Remains and the TVA as a whole, we begin to realize how insignificant every other character in the MCU really is. Like Thanos pales in comparison to He Who Remains. Because as we know, killing him will only bring him back in different forms. And the TVA has control over everything that happens to everyone in the MCU. That was probably the biggest takeaway of the entire series. The insignificance of everyone in the MCU compared to He Who Remains. Now when it comes to the visual aesthetic, I think the TVA deserves special recognition in this series. The way the TVA was depicted with the dark, warm tones and brutalist architecture gave it a very dictator-y feel, which foreshadowed the shadiness of the whole organization. It also made it feel very 70s but modern at the same time. But there were also parts that I was also not such a big fan of, such as that episode on Lamentis. It felt like a very cheap Star Wars ripoff. The visual effects of Loki and Sylvie walking with the purple skies in the background looked like awful green screen execution. They need to get that tech that the Mandalorian used for their backgrounds. And lastly, while their costume was mostly on par with regular MCU movies, some just stood out as horrible. The most obvious example being that of classic Loki. His costume was so bad. Like, I know it's supposed to be a tribute to Loki's original costume design from the comics, but it looks like a cheap Halloween costume that many could mistake as a weird version of Kermit the Frog. Another bad costume was those of the train conductors in Lamentis. Wow, Lamentis was really not a good episode. Those blue costumes also felt like bad Halloween costumes that would be worn on Maroon 5's Don't Wanna Know music video. Overall, I would give Loki Season 1 a rating of 8.5 out of 10, which is pretty good. Let me know if you agreed or disagreed with anything I said. That's it.